You look in the mirror and you see your grandfather's nose, or maybe you catch yourself pacing the floor and you realize you have that exact same restless energy your mother always had.
Yeah, it is wild how that works.
Right. Usually when we talk about what makes us who we are, we think about genetics. Like the biological kind. Your character, your appearance, your health, so much of your life trajectory feels, I don't know, basically determined by these microscopic strands of DNA. It is a biological inheritance you can't really opt out of.
Exactly. I mean, it is the underlying code that builds the entire machine,
Yeah.
right? It dictates the boundaries of what is physically possible for you as an individual organism.
But okay, then you zoom out. You stop looking at the individual in the mirror and you start looking at an entire nation, like millions of people, complex systems, centuries of history. And suddenly you have to ask, does a nation have DNA?
That is a massive question.
It really is. Like, is the current reality of a society just the inevitable expression of its historical and cultural genes? That is the premise we are exploring today in this deep dive. We are looking at a short, but honestly incredibly dense translated essay from December 2021.
Yeah, by an author named Sue Feng.
Right, and the title poses a really provocative question. It is called, How Far is the Chinese Nation from Civilization?
And just to pause here for a second, because we are dealing with a text that touches on national identity and societal evaluation, we should really establish our parameters right away.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Our role here as your guides, it is not to judge Suofeng's geopolitical views or to take a political stance on any specific nation. We are simply using his framework as a fascinating philosophical lens. The goal is to neutrally unpack the mechanics of his argument so you, the listener, can evaluate the concepts for yourself.
Exactly. We are entirely impartial here. So Suofeng builds his whole premise on that biological metaphor. He argues that just like a person's traits come from their genes, the status quo of a nation, well, it isn't formed overnight.
Right. It is this deep, slow accumulation of history and culture.
Yeah. He writes that, and I'm quoting here, the appearance is determined by the essence, and the status quo is the inheritance of the past.
What's fascinating here is how he treats the present as a direct, almost inescapable inheritance of the past. Like, if the appearance of a nation, meaning how its institutions function or how its people behave, is determined by its historical essence, it implies you cannot simply declare a society to be civilized just by, writing a new constitution.
Or building modern skyscrapers or whatever.
Exactly. The civilization has to grow organically from the right cultural DNA.
So if a nation's current state is just its cultural DNA playing out in real time, we need a way to measure what those genes are producing, right?
Yeah, we need a metric.
And Shuifeng introduces this 9-part framework to measure any society's proximity to true civilization. And what is interesting is he doesn't start with grand philosophical ideals or like technological supremacy. He starts right down in the dirt with the baseline physical realities of the people.
He really does. He
Yeah.
establishes this firm prerequisite. Basically, a society hasn't even reached the starting line of civilization if it hasn't secured the most vulnerable.
Okay, let's unpack this. What does that actually look like in his framework?
Well, point 1 argues that all workers must be able to live and work in peace without worrying about food, clothing, shelter, or transportation. Plus, the old must be looked after and the young must be well educated.
Right. Sticking with our biological metaphor, I kind of look at these basic needs, food, shelter, elder care, as the cell membrane of the organism.
Oh, that is a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's the protective barrier. Like, it doesn't mean the cell is doing anything magnificent yet, but it keeps the organism from collapsing.
Exactly. But Suifeng immediately pairs this with point 6, another requirement. He says the poor must have ladders and channels for promotion, the hope of living, and the desire to pursue a better life.
See, I have a hard time accepting this second half as a tangible metric.
Really? Why is that?
Well, you can mandate a cell membrane. A government can build housing or distribute food. But hope is a feeling. How can a society structurally legislate hope? And why is it a requirement for civilization?
I think you're looking at hope purely as an emotion or a mood. Swelm is actually framing hope as a structural mechanism.
A structural mechanism.
Yeah, think of it as the mitochondria in your biological analogy.
Okay, the powerhouse of the cell.
Exactly, the energy source driving the organism forward. If you only provide food and shelter but there are no ladders for promotion, you haven't created a civilization. You've created a zoological enclosure.
Oh, wow. A zoological enclosure. That is a heavy way to look at it.
It is, but it makes sense, right? A society structurally legislates hope, by removing artificial barriers to upward mobility. If the poorest members of a society look at their circumstances and cannot realistically envision a path to improve them through their own effort, the society becomes paralyzed. The friction just disappears.
So hope is the synthesis of physical welfare and psychological optimism.
Yes, exactly. Without both, the cultural DNA is flawed.
That makes a lot of sense. The latter isn't a promise of wealth, it's the removal of an invisible ceiling.
Precisely.
So once you have that functioning organism fed, educated, and energized by the possibility of upward mobility, the next major evolution in this cultural DNA is how the organism is governed. This requires a massive shift in how authority flows.
Right, moving on to point 2. Wefeng states that in a civilized society, the government is a servant to all citizens. It is not a manager, and it is certainly not a ruler.
Which is a pretty radical departure from history.
It really is. Throughout the vast majority of human history, across almost all cultures, the state has viewed itself precisely as a ruler, or at best, an administrative manager of the masses.
Right. And a ruler dictates from the top down, extracting resources and obedience, while a manager organizes from the top down, mostly prioritizing efficiency and order.
Exactly. But a servant exists entirely to facilitate the needs of the master.
So by labeling the government a servant, Wefeng is saying the state's only legitimate reason for existing is to serve the citizens. It flips the dynamic from top-down extraction to bottom-up facilitation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when a government is a manager, the citizen is merely an employee or a resource. But when the government is a servant, the citizen possesses ultimate sovereignty over their own domain.
And this shift in authority is the only way to enable the kind of societal progress he is describing, which actually leads into my favorite imagery in the entire essay.
Oh, the quote about the king.
Yes. To illustrate the sovereignty, Huifeng describes the absolute sanctity of private space in point 4. He uses the striking phrase, "Wind can enter, rain can enter, the king cannot enter."
It is so poetic.
It really paints such a vivid picture. Your roof might be leaking, the wind might be howling through the cracks in your walls, but no matter how impoverished your private space is, the highest power in the land cannot cross your threshold without your consent. Other people cannot enter at will without the owner's permission.
It establishes this invisible, impenetrable boundary around the individual. And in point 5, he extends that boundary beyond physical space directly to physical possessions. He notes that private property cannot be deprived, and it must be fiercely protected by legislation.
But he includes a very specific qualifier there, right?
Yes, he does. He says this is property created and accumulated by diligence and wisdom.
Right, so he ties the protection of the property to the human effort that generated it. He doesn't just say, like, you get to keep your stuff.
The mechanism here is crucial. The state isn't just protecting a physical object. It is legislatively protecting the citizen's effort. If you use your diligence and your wisdom to build something, a civilized society guarantees that a stronger force, like the state, cannot simply come and take it.
Because if effort isn't protected, the hope and ladders for promotion we discussed earlier instantly vanish.
Exactly. Why climb the ladder if the king can just take whatever you earned at the top? When you combine the government as a servant, the sanctity of the private home against the king, and the legislative protection of hard-earned property, you are describing a society that treats the individual as an autonomous, dignified entity.
Okay, so we've established a very secure core. The individual is fed, mobile, sovereign in their own home, and protected from the arbitrary whims of the state.
Right, the foundation is solid.
And here's where it gets really interesting. From this secure core, Xufeng begins to widen the lens. He looks at how this civilized citizen interacts with the broader world, creating what looks to me like an expanding circle of empathy.
I love that framing. An expanding circle of empathy.
Thanks. So the first expansion is autonomy outside the home. Point 3 dictates that individuals must have the freedom to move domestically and abroad, the freedom to speak, to express different views, and the freedom of belief and association.
And you can see how these freedoms naturally cascade from the previous points. I mean, if the government is truly a servant, it has no authority to tell the master where to travel, who to associate with, or what to think.
Right, that makes logical sense.
But beyond just being a nice ideal, intellectual freedom serves an evolutionary purpose for the culture. If an organism cannot adapt to changing environments, it dies.
So free speech is like an adaptation mechanism.
Exactly. Freedom of speech and the expression of different views are the mechanisms through which a society stress tests its own ideas, identifies internal flaws, and mutates its cultural DNA to survive new challenges.
Wow, okay. Then the circle of empathy widens to how a society views the people who actually make it function. In point 8, Schufeng writes that craftsmen, meaning technicians and engineers, artists, inventors, experts, teachers, doctors, and workers from all walks of life are respected and loved.
And the word loved is a very high bar for societal appreciation. But notice who is explicitly missing from that list.
Yeah, he doesn't mention
Or
politicians.
military conquerors or aristocratic elites.
He is prioritizing the builders, the healers, the educators, and the creators. These are the people maintaining the physical and cultural infrastructure of the society.
Right. In a less civilized DNA, a society might revere those who wield power or violence. Schwiffing is arguing that true civilization reveres those who generate value and sustain life.
And sustaining life becomes the overarching theme as the circle expands even further. He steps completely outside of human society in point 7, arguing that a civilized nation does not harm animals at will, especially wild animals. He says everyone must revere life and nature.
This raises an important question, though.
Yeah, I found this addition fascinating. Usually we measure civilizations by their grand monuments, their economic output, or their technological leaps. Why use animal welfare, specifically wild animals, as a core metric for national civilization?
It comes down to a test of power versus respect. Think about it. A domestic animal might offer you labor or food. It has a transactional value.
Sure.
But a wild animal in its natural habitat offers the average citizen nothing. It cannot advocate for itself, it cannot pay taxes, and it cannot vote. And if your society operates on the underlying principle that the strong can exploit the weak without consequence, that will eventually express itself in how you treat nature.
Oh, wow. So how you treat the truly defenseless reveals your true character.
Exactly. Reverence for non-human life shows an incredibly deep level of cultural maturity because it demonstrates that a society protects things not because they are useful, but because they have inherent value. The way a nation treats a wild animal is the ultimate test of its empathy.
That is a profound insight. If you respect a life that can do nothing for you, you have fundamentally conquered the primitive urge to dominate. And Shui Feng applies that exact same logic, that exact same test of power versus respect, to the final, widest circle.
The international stage, point 9.
Right. He discusses how a nation interacts with other nationalities and countries. He says other nationalities must be treated kindly, and other countries should not be attacked in the name of national interests.
The phrasing he uses to describe foreign policy is deeply psychological. He is essentially diagnosing national geopolitics as individual psychology.
It's stunning. He writes that in a civilized nation, others' shortcomings are not contrasted to your advantages, and others' advantages are not envied because of your shortcomings.
He is describing a well-adjusted, secure person, but applying those emotional traits to an entire nation of millions.
Exactly.
Think about the mechanics of national conflict. Why do nations constantly highlight the failures of their neighbors?
To distract from their own problems, usually.
Precisely. It is often a distraction mechanism. If a government can point across the border and say, look at their shortcomings, look how much better our advantages are, they don't have to address their own domestic failings. It breeds an artificial, arrogant nationalism.
Yeah.
Conversely, looking at a neighbor's advantages and allowing that to breed envy and hostility is a symptom of deep national insecurity.
Avoiding that behavior takes a massive amount of psychological maturity. It requires a culture that is entirely secure in its own identity. A civilized nation, according to this framework, does not need to punch down to feel tall, and it does not need to resent those who are currently succeeding.
It operates with a quiet, confident benevolence on the global stage.
It is the ultimate realization of all the previous structural points. I mean, if your people's basic needs are met, if they have hope and upward mobility, if their homes and property are protected from the state, if they are free to think and speak, and if they inherently revere life itself.
Of course, they wouldn't feel the need to aggressively attack a neighboring country out of envy. A society built on that DNA has no appetite for manufactured geopolitical insecurity.
It is one continuous logical strand of cultural evolution, and we have traced that entire strand today. We started with the microscopic concept of cultural DNA and followed it all the way to global empathy.
We unpacked the baseline needs of food, shelter, and elder care, and explored why upward mobility isn't just a luxury, but the structural mitochondria that provides hope.
We examine the invisible boundaries that protect the citizen, the fundamental shift of the government from a top-down manager to a bottom-up servant.
We looked at the audacious idea that a king cannot enter a peasant's home, and that property built by diligence and wisdom must be fiercely protected by law to preserve the value of human effort.
And finally, we watched the circle widen. We looked at why intellectual autonomy is necessary for cultural adaptation, why a mature society loves its builders and healers over its conquerors, how the reverence for wild animals proves a society respects life over power.
And how a truly civilized nation outgrows the need for geopolitical arrogance or envy.
So where does that leave us?
Well, at the conclusion of his essay, Shofeng gives the reader an instruction. He writes, "The above 9 points are the signs of a national civilization. You can calculate how far the Chinese nation is from civilization based on your own feelings and the current situation." He leaves the final calculation entirely up to the reader.
And as we stated at the beginning, we are honoring our role as your guides. It is not our intent to make that calculation for you, nor are we passing judgment on the nation in the title or any other. Our mission was to unpack the mechanics of this 9-point framework.
Because regardless of where you live or what your political beliefs are, Shofeng's list acts as an incredibly powerful diagnostic tool. You can hold it up to any society, any community, or any governance structure you interact with, and ask yourself, how many of these traits do I see functioning in the reality around me?
It forces you to evaluate human progress, not by economic output or military might, but by the dignity it affords the individual.
Exactly.
That brings us back to the hook of this entire exploration. The opening premise was that a person's character comes from their genes, and a nation's current status quo is the inheritance of its historical and cultural past. It is the idea that we are the product of the code written long before we got here. So I want to leave you with one final question to mull over today.
A little food for thought.
Yes. If Shufeng is right and a nation's current state is built on deeply ingrained cultural DNA, is it actually possible for a society to intentionally mutate its own genetic code? Can a nation consciously rewrite its history and culture to achieve these 9 points of civilization, or are nations forever bound by the slow, uncontrollable evolution of their past? Something to think about the next time you look at the world around you. Thanks for diving deep with us today.